My name is Jose Ruelas, and I'll be talking about the internment of Japanese Americans. I'll be telling it from the perspective of the Japanese Americans that were relocated. Let's begin with the time frame. So the Japanese internment camps were in effect for 4 years from February 19th of 1942 to March 20th of 1946. The newspaper is about the Japanese Americans relocating out of California. Now that we have an idea of the time frame, let's go to processing. When the Japanese Americans were getting relocated, they had to act quickly. Here is a picture of a store. Notice that it said evacuation cell. Japanese Americans, business owners, had to sell everything they had before they relocated. It is estimated that Japanese Americans lost $2 to $5 billion when they sold their belongings before getting relocated. Here's a copy of a letter to a bank. When the Japanese Americans were relocated, their bank accounts were frozen. That means that Japanese Americans could not access their money in banks. I will now describe the relocation of Japanese Americans from their homes to the internment camp locations. I now will discuss relocation. Let's first look at the pie chart. We see that 75% of Japanese Americans lived in California and almost 90% of all Japanese Americans living along the West Coast. Let's now look at the map showing the internment camps. First, notice the pink area labeled Inclusion Area. This is the area where Japanese Americans were relocated from. After Pearl Harbor was attacked, there was fear that Japan would invade the U.S. along its west coast. The idea was to prevent Japanese Americans from possibly supporting an invasion. Notice how far the camps were from the west coast. My focus now will be on the Gila River camp. Here is a copy of a map of this camp. It was located about 23 miles south of ASU. Notice the I-10 freeway along the eastern part of the map. For those of you familiar with the I-10 south of Phoenix, the map shows the area on the west side of the I-10 from mile marker 175 to 180. Now I want to share a very interesting part of my journey box. Look at this small portion of the map. Using Google Maps, we can see where the camp was located as it appears today. Using this aerial view, we see the location of the landfills. We also can see the monument built by the Japanese Americans. The buildings that were around the monument are gone. However, one can zoom in and see the pilings and other foundation structures that still remain from these buildings. How did the Japanese Americans get to the Gila River camp? What did the camp look like? How did the Japanese Americans adjust to the new surroundings? These are some questions we will answer as we focus on the Gila River camp. As we look into the topic of the Gila River internment camp, think of how Japanese Americans may have experienced coming to the camp. For those Japanese Americans coming to Gila River, many came by train and arrived in Casa Grande. From there, they were transported to the camp. When the first Japanese Americans arrived at the Gila River camp, they saw that the camp was not completed. Many of the buildings were unfinished. The walkways were not done, the electric lines were unconnected, and the barracks did not have heaters. Men and women had to use community washrooms. When the camp opened, the water supply was such that there was not enough pressure for the toilets to always flush. Surprisingly, the Japanese Americans showed resilience in spite of these and other issues. At the Gila River camp, the residents worked to make the best of the situation. Children went to school in classrooms set up at the camp. Over time, there was a high school in the camp that even had a marching band. The Japanese Americans helped construct a building that was used for religious services. Notice how neatly the building appears and also the walkways and landscaping around the building, where before there was nothing. In a move to show the American public that the Japanese Americans were treated well, First Lady Eleanor Roosevelt visited the camp. One can imagine how the picture shown here was taken to portray a positive image of the camp. In reality, the Japanese Americans had to endure the challenges of the weather in Arizona and its effect on the buildings. Walls warped due to the heat, as did the floors. Japanese Americans often lost small items due to gaps in the floor. The poor design and construction of the living quarters were an ongoing problem. Despite their challenges, the Japanese Americans tried to make the best of their situation. They organized a baseball team, as many Japanese Americans enjoyed baseball. The team was quite good and played teams from the Negro League and the Pacific Coast League. The Japanese Americans also observed events that were recognized in their culture. Here we see pictures of a Harvest Day celebration with a parade and floats. The last picture shows one of the last groups of Japanese Americans boarding buses for the trip back to California when the camp was closing. It's important to note that leaving the camp was a step into other challenges the Japanese Americans would experience as they re-entered their previous neighborhoods. In conclusion, I hope people get a sense of what the Japanese Americans went through. Also, certainly I believe that the topic of the internment of Japanese Americans is one that is kept quiet because it does raise many questions how the U.S. treated some of its own citizens. Thank you.